Imagine you are 28 years old.
Okay.
And you're dragged out into this freezing public square in St. Petersburg, Russia.
Right, in the dead of winter.
Exactly. You are tied to a wooden post. You're forced to put on this white death shroud. And then a line of soldiers raises their rifles, aiming directly at your chest.
Just horrifying.
You have exactly 3 minutes left to live. So how does a human brain process those final 180 seconds?
I mean, it almost can't.
Right. And more importantly, what happens to that brain when, at the very last possible millisecond, a messenger rides into the square and announces that it was all just a prank?
A literal state-sponsored prank.
A political stunt orchestrated by the government just to terrify you. Your life is spared, but you're going to a labor camp instead. How does a mind ever recover from that?
Well, the short answer is it doesn't.
No. Because if you are the author, Fyodor Dostoevsky, you don't recover. You use that unimaginable psychological trauma to write, well, the ultimate blueprint for a justified murder.
It really is a profound starting point, because you just cannot separate the absolute terror of that mock execution from the psychological realism that he later, put down on paper.
Exactly. And welcome to the Deep Dive. We are so thrilled you could join us today because today's mission is a truly fascinating one.
It's going to be a heavy one, but so good.
Oh, absolutely. We are going to explore the complete anatomy of a justified crime. We're going to look at the severe psychological toll of profound alienation, and we're going to walk down a very desperate, very muddy path to redemption.
Muddy is definitely the right word for it.
So we are pulling from a massive, incredibly rich stack of sources today. We've got comprehensive literary analyses, historical context notes, psychological profiles, and critical interpretations.
All centered on Dostoevsky's 1866 masterpiece, Crime and Punishment.
Yes. And alongside that, to help us really understand how trauma shapes art, our sources have provided this brilliant comparative glimpse into Charles Dickens and his highly autobiographical novel, David Copperfield.
It is a tremendous stack of material. And what it really provides us is a masterclass in psychological profiling.
Right. Way before that was even a real thing.
Exactly. This was written long before the actual field of criminology was even officially formulated. Yet it maps out the criminal mind with a precision that modern forensic psychologists still study today.
Now, you might be asking yourself as you listen to this, why should you care about an 1860s Russian novel right now?
It's a fair question.
It is. But, just think about the world we are living in today. We are completely obsessed with true crime.
Oh, totally obsessed.
And we have a literal epidemic of what the internet calls main character syndrome. We are living in an era of intense, toxic intellectual polarization where everyone thinks they own the absolute truth.
Right.
So this deep dive provides the ultimate timeless blueprint of what happens when a person truly, deeply believes that the rules of humanity just don't apply to them.
Precisely. Because this isn't just like a standard murder mystery.
No.
In a traditional murder mystery, you spend the whole time trying to figure out who did it. You're looking for the smoking gun.
Classic whodunit.
Right. But here, we know the killer on page 1. We are literally inside his head before the crime even happens.
Yeah.
It is a why done it, not a who done it.
Okay, let's unpack this. What if you could commit the perfect crime? And I don't mean just robbing a bank to get rich.
No, something much darker.
Right. I mean, what if you genuinely intellectually believed that by committing a brutal murder, you were actually doing humanity a massive favor?
Wow.
What if you thought you were a Superman, like an extraordinary individual, and stepping over the law wasn't just your right, but your actual moral duty?
That is the terrifying premise at the very heart of this work. But to understand how a human mind can twist itself into believing that premise, our sources suggest we have to start with the architects.
The creators.
Yes. We have to understand the deeply traumatized minds of the creators, the authors who breathe life into these dark narratives. We have to look at the crucible of the creator.
Right, taking trauma and turning it into art. Because you don't just wake up one sunny Tuesday and write the greatest psychological thriller of the 19th century without having a few ghosts in your own closet.
You definitely do not.
So let's go back to that firing squad. I brought it up at the very beginning, but I want to really dig into the how and the why of it. Why was a 28-year-old novelist tied to a post in the first place?
It basically comes down to the political climate of Russia in the late 1840s.
Whoa.
So Dostoevsky was associating with a group called the Petrushevsky Circle.
Okay.
And they weren't violent terrorists. They were intellectuals, writers, minor government officials. They gathered to discuss utopian socialism, the emancipation of the serfs, and Western philosophy.
So basically a subversive book club.
Exactly. But for Tsar Nicholas I, who was terrified of the revolutions that were just swooking across Europe in 1848, even discussing these ideas was a profound threat.
He couldn't risk it.
Right. So the secret police arrested them.
And the Tsar decides to make an absolute example of them. But he doesn't just execute them straightforwardly. He designs a psychological torture chamber.
It's so calculated.
It really is.
Yeah.
Our sources detail this mock execution, and it is chilling. They read the death sentences aloud in the square. They let the prisoners kiss the cross. They break swords over their heads to symbolize their civil death.
Just completely stripping them of everything.
Yeah. And they tie the first 3 men to the posts, and Dostoevsky is in the second batch. He is standing there, watching his friends, genuinely believing he has 3 minutes left to live.
Think about the physiological response happening in his body in those 3 minutes. The massive dump of cortisol and adrenaline. The hyper-focus of the brain as it faces the absolute certainty of non-existence.
It's hard to even fathom.
Dostoevsky actually wrote to his brother about those exact moments later on. He said his mind became incredibly sharp, like he noticed the sunlight reflecting off the golden dome of a nearby church. And he felt that those rays of light were his new nature, that he was about to merge with them. His brain was desperately clinging to every microscopic detail of the physical world because it was about to be ripped away.
And then the drum rolls. The rifles are raised, and a cart drives into the square with the decree from the Tsar commuting the sentences to hard labor in Siberia.
Just at the absolute last second.
Yeah. One of the prisoners actually went permanently insane right there on the spot. His mind just snapped, but Dostoevsky's brain, it didn't break. It rewired itself.
It fundamentally altered his perception of human existence. When you face the abyss like that, all the trivialities of life are just burned away.
Everything else seems meaningless.
Right. He realized in that freezing square that life itself is a gift, that every minute is an eternity of potential. But he also realized the depths of human cruelty. I mean, the state had just played a godlike game with his soul.
And they don't give him time to recover either. They immediately shackle him in 20 pounds of iron and march him to Omsk, Siberia, for 4 years of hard labor.
4 years in those conditions.
He is stripped of his title, his wealth, his writing materials. He is living in a squalid, freezing barracks with actual murderers, thieves, and violent convicts.
And on top of all of this, he is suffering from severe epilepsy.
Right, the physical toll.
Yes, the epilepsy is a crucial component of his psychological makeup. Our sources note that these violent epileptic seizures began to plague him severely around this time, though the roots might go back even further.
His childhood, right?
Yeah, psychologists and biographers often link the onset of this intense physical and emotional instability to another horrific event in his youth, which was the murder of his own father.
Which is a whole other layer of trauma. His father was a deeply unpopular landowner, and it's widely believed that he was murdered by his own outraged serfs.
Yeah.
They allegedly poured vodka down his throat until he choked to death.
It's brutal.
So Dostoevsky is carrying the trauma of his father's brutal murder, the trauma of his own mock execution, the brutal conditions of a Siberian prison camp, and the neurological electrical storms of epilepsy.
It's almost too much for one person to bear. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to ask, how does a writer process that level of compounding trauma? How does it manifest in the work?
This is where our sources introduce that brilliant comparison to Charles Dickens.
Right, because Dickens, who was Dostoevsky's contemporary, and whom Dostoevsky actually read while he was in exile, also had a childhood defined by severe, defining trauma.
I love this comparison because it shows 2 completely different biological and artistic coping mechanisms. Dickens's trauma started when he was just 12 years old.
Too young.
His parents were incredibly irresponsible with money, to the point of absurdity. His father accrued so much debt that the entire family was thrown into the Marshalsea debtors' prison in London.
But Charles wasn't, right?
Exactly. Because he was old enough to work, he was kept out of the prison. He was forced to rent this miserable little room and go to work in Warren's blacking factory.
Oh, the blacking factory. It was a rat-infested sweatshop right down by the river.
Sounds awful.
For 10 hours a day, the young, brilliant, sensitive Charles Dickens was forced to paste labels onto pots of boot polish.
Wow.
For a child who had dreams of being an educated gentleman, this was a profound psychological amputation. He felt entirely abandoned by his parents, especially his mother.
Because she didn't want him to leave, even later.
Right. She actually argued that he should stay at the factory working even after his father inherited some money and was released from prison.
The sense of betrayal there is staggering. And what's wild is that Dickens hid this trauma his entire life. He became the most famous author in the world, the toast of London society, and he never spoke of the blacking factory.
His own wife didn't even know about it until after he died.
That's insane. But the trauma had to go somewhere, so he channeled it into his heavily disguised autobiography, David Copperfield.
Yeah. In David Copperfield, Dickens takes his real-life, financially disastrous parents and turns them into the delightful, eccentric, but hopeless Micawber family.
He kind of softens them.
He does. He makes them lovable. But all of his deep-seated repressed anger, his fury at being forced into child labor, his resentment toward his mother's betrayal, he takes all of that toxic energy and projects it onto a fictional villain.
The wicked stepfather, Mr. Murdstone.
Exactly.
It's like Dickens processed his trauma by building a literary dollhouse.
A dollhouse, yeah.
He created this incredibly elaborate, highly controlled miniature world where he could disguise his personal demons in Victorian clothing, and then he could safely punch them.
I love that analogy.
He could exact his revenge on Mr. Murdstone from the safety and comfort of his mahogany writing desk. He makes the bad guys ugly and obviously evil. He makes the good guys pure, and he punishes the bad guys in the end. It's a way of restoring order to a childhood that had no order.
That is exactly how his psychological mechanism worked. But now look at Dostoevsky.
Right.
Dostoevsky didn't build a safe Victorian dollhouse.
Yep.
He didn't create a neat moral universe where the bad guys wear black hats and the good guys wear white hats.
No, absolutely not.
Because his trauma wasn't just about social shame. His trauma was existential. He had stood on the precipice of death. He had lived intimately with actual murderers in Siberia.
So Dostoevsky processed his trauma by dragging the reader directly inside the claustrophobic, feverish, suffocating mind of a killer. He doesn't give you a safe distance. He locks you in the room with the madness.
And crucially, his time in Siberia gave him a highly unconventional, totally radical view on the concept of justice.
How so?
Well, in the labor camp, he observed firsthand that physical punishment meted out by the state, the shackles, the beatings, the forced labor, did absolutely nothing to actually deter a criminal or change their soul.
Interesting.
The lawgivers in St. Petersburg thought that building harsher prisons would solve crime. But Dostoevsky saw that these criminals felt absolutely no remorse. They just hated the state more.
He realized that the legal system is basically just a physical transaction. You do the crime, the state takes away your freedom, but it doesn't touch the mind. Dostoevsky realized that true punishment, the only punishment that actually transforms a human being, must come from the criminal's own conscience. The criminal has to physically and spiritually accept their own guilt.
So, with that profound understanding of Dostoevsky's psychological crucible, the mock execution, the epilepsy, his views on the failure of state punishment, we can finally see the soil from which crime and punishment grew.
We are ready to step into the stifling, impoverished slums of 1860s St. Petersburg and meet a character who is experiencing a complete, torturous mental breakdown.
Let's do it.
Let's introduce Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. And even before we talk about what he does, we have to talk about who he is, starting with his name.
The name is so important.
Our sources point out that his name comes from the Russian word raskol, which means schism or split.
It historically refers to a major splintering in the Russian Orthodox Church, but here it is the perfect psychological diagnosis for this character.
Well,
Raskolnikov is a man whose brain is torn entirely in two.
the architecture of his split mind is the foundation of the entire psychological profile we're going to build. Let's look at the two sides of the schism.
Okay, on one side you have this morose, alienated, incredibly egotistical young man.
Very egotistical.
He is a former law student who has dropped out because he is completely destitute. He isolates himself in a tiny, coffin-like garret room under the roof of a 5-story building.
And the room has peeling yellow wallpaper. Which is significant, right?
Very. Yellow is a color Dostoevsky uses repeatedly throughout the novel to symbolize physical decay, sickness, and moral corruption.
So he's essentially living in a hot, dusty, yellow closet. He's disconnected from his university, from his friends, from his family.
Total isolation.
And in this absolute vacuum of isolation, his brain starts to eat itself. He starts formulating a grand, terrifying theory. He actually writes a legal article about it and gets it published.
Yes, the theory of the extraordinary man.
Right.
Raskolnikov theorizes that all of humanity is naturally divided into two distinct categories, ordinary men and extraordinary men.
Okay, break that down.
Well, ordinary men are the masses. They are conservative, obedient, and their only biological purpose is to reproduce and maintain the current social order. They are just the material.
But then there are the extraordinary men, people like Napoleon Bonaparte or the ancient lawgivers like Hergus or Solon. These are the disruptors.
The ones who push humanity forward into the future.
And according to Raskolnikov's logic, because these men bring new ideas, they are naturally at war with the old laws. Therefore, these extraordinary men have an inherent, almost biological right to transgress or step over the law.
He argues it with chilling mathematical precision.
He really does.
He literally writes that if someone stood in the way of Isaac Newton or Johannes Kepler sharing their scientific discoveries with the world, Newton would have the absolute moral right to remove those people.
But to kill them if necessary.
Yes, for the greater good of mankind's progression. The laws of ordinary men do not apply to the saviors of humanity.
And here is the fatal leap in logic. Raskolnikov, sitting in his dirty yellow room wearing literal rags, hasn't eaten in 3 days, has convinced himself that he might be one of these extraordinary men.
He thinks he's a Napoleon waiting to happen.
But then you look at the other side of the schism, because if he were just a cold, calculating, megalomaniacal psychopath, he wouldn't be interesting.
Right. Dostoevsky makes him simultaneously capable of deep, spontaneous, almost reckless compassion.
This is the part that makes him so deeply confusing to analyze. For instance, he goes to a tavern and meets this pathetic, ruined government clerk named Marmeladov.
Marmeladov.
Marmeladov is an alcoholic who has literally drank his family into starvation. He has forced his own innocent teenage daughter, Sonia, to get a yellow ticket.
Which was the official ID for a prostitute.
Right, just so the family can buy food. Marmeladov is the definition of a parasite. And what does Raskolnikov do?
He helps the drunk man home, sees the squalor his family lives in, and impulsively empties his pockets, leaving all his remaining money on their windowsill.
And it doesn't stop there. Later, when Marmeladov is killed after drunkenly wandering in front of a horse-drawn carriage, Raskolnikov gives the grieving family the last 20 rubles he has in the world.
Money his own mother just sent him.
Exactly, just so they can pay for a proper funeral. He also spontaneously intervenes in the street to protect a young, intoxicated, dazed girl from a predatory man who is stalking her. He actually fights the man off and gives money to a policeman to get her a cab home.
He's also fiercely protective of his own family. He loves his mother, Pulcheria, and his sister, Dunya.
In fact, he violently hates that they are sacrificing their own futures to support him.
Yeah, he receives this heartbreaking letter from his mother explaining that Dunya is going to marry a wealthy, arrogant bureaucrat named Luzhin.
And it's obvious to Raskolnikov that Dunya doesn't love this man.
Not at all.
She is essentially selling herself into a legally sanctioned, loveless marriage just so Luzhin might eventually give Raskolnikov a job in his law firm.
Raskolnikov is disgusted. He refuses to allow his sister to prostitute herself for his career.
So we have a profound psychological contradiction. A man who theorizes that the weak can be murdered for the benefit of the strong, yet who continually sacrifices his own survival to help the weakest and most vulnerable people in society.
It's a huge paradox.
Right. But I have to push back here because I read through these sources, I look at the historical context, and I look at this character, and I have to ask, is Raskolnikov actually a grand philosopher driven by these high-minded ideals of saving his sister and proving his Superman status? Or is he just a broke, hungry, desperate college dropout who is trying to rationalize mugging a mean old lady to pay his past due rent?
That is a great point.
Isn't this just severe poverty masking itself as intellectual philosophy?
It is a critical question.
Mm.
And it's one Dostoevsky deliberately forces the reader to grapple with.
Okay.
If you ask a modern criminal psychologist, they would say Raskolnikov is using intellectualization as a defense mechanism to mask his feelings of inadequacy and financial impotence.
That makes total sense.
But to understand why his brain chose these specific philosophies to justify his desperation, we have to look at the historical context our sources provide. Raskolnikov represents a very specific, real-life Russian trope of the 1860s, which is the superfluous man.
The superfluous man. Basically, an entire generation of educated, highly intelligent young individuals who felt completely alienated from traditional society.
Right.
The serfs had just been emancipated in 1861, the old social order was collapsing, and there was this massive vacuum of meaning.
Exactly. And nature abhors a vacuum. Our sources note that Dostoevsky viewed this generation of disenfranchised youth as being infected by Western European philosophies that had flooded into Russia.
Specifically, two major intellectual viruses, nihilism and utilitarianism.
Let's break those down, because they are crucial.
Yeah, go ahead.
Nihilism in this context is the complete rejection of absolute moral values, traditional religious principles, and the authority of the state or the church. It's the belief that nothing is inherently sacred.
And utilitarianism is the philosophical idea that an action is morally right if it benefits the majority. It's a mathematical calculation.
It is the ultimate ends justify the means philosophy.
Right.
It posits that human life is basically a spreadsheet. If you can sacrifice one life to save 1,000, the math dictates that you must make the sacrifice.
And Dostoevsky absolutely despised these ideas.
Oh, he hated them.
He believed they stripped humanity of its soul, and he uses Raskolnikov as a vessel to show the ultimate, terrifying, logical conclusion of that mindset.
He really does.
I want to make a modern analogy here because this is so incredibly relevant. Think about the modern tech industry, specifically the early days of Silicon Valley's disruption culture.
Well, this is a good one.
You had all these brilliant, young, somewhat alienated coders who believed that the old rules of taxicab regulations or hotel zoning laws were stupid and archaic. So they adopted a philosophy of move fast and break things. They believed they were the extraordinary men building the future, so the old laws didn't apply to them. They were acting purely on a sort of technological utilitarianism.
That's spot on.
Now, apply that exact same move fast and break things arrogance to human life, and you get Raskolnikov.
That is a phenomenal parallel. It is the exact same psychological mechanism, just applied to mortality instead of economics.
Yeah, exactly.
So Raskolnikov takes these abstract theories, utilitarianism, nihilism, his own extraordinary man concept, and he decides he is going to test them in the real world.
She decides he is going to murder an old pawnbroker named Alyona Ivanovna.
And he justifies it meticulously. Alyona Ivanovna is not a good person.
No, she's awful.
She is stingy, she is cruel, she beats her meek, intellectually disabled younger sister, Lizaveta, who essentially acts as her slave.
It's terrible.
Alyona takes advantage of desperate students by giving them pennies for their family heirlooms. Raskolnikov convinces himself she is a louse, a parasite sucking the blood of the poor.
So he calculates that killing her, stealing her hoarded wealth, and using it to finish his education and help his family would be a massive net positive for the world.
But what's fascinating here, and what elevates this from a crime story to a psychological masterpiece, is how Dostoevsky illustrates the absolute illogic of the perfect crime.
Right, because theories are clean, but reality is messy.
Exactly. Raskolnikov's theories sound completely airtight when he is lying on the sofa in his isolated, dusty garret room. In a vacuum, the math works out perfectly. One dead parasite equals dozens of saved lives.
But when he tries to take this sterile intellectual theory and apply it to the physical, chaotic, bloody, real world, the horrifying reality completely shatters his logic.
And we see that logic begin to shatter before he even commits the crime.
Yes, because his subconscious is desperately trying to warn him. Our sources emphasize how crucial dreams are in this narrative for revealing the subconscious truth.
But dreams are vital.
A few days before the murder, Raskolnikov falls asleep in some bushes after wandering around the city in a daze. And he has this horrific, intensely vivid dream.
It is arguably one of the most powerful and disturbing scenes in all of world literature. Let's look at the mechanics of this dream.
Okay.
He dreams he is a 7-year-old boy again, walking with his father past a tavern in his hometown. Outside the tavern, a drunken peasant named Mikolka is trying to force his old, frail, emaciated horse to pull a massive cart full of heavy people.
And the horse obviously can't do it.
Right. So the peasant flies into a rage and starts mercilessly beating the horse to death with a whip, then a wooden shaft, and finally an iron crowbar, while the crowd laughs and cheers.
Oh, man, it's so hard to even read.
It is.
The young Raskolnikov in the dream is absolutely traumatized. He pushes his way through the laughing crowd, crying hysterically, and puts his little arms around the dead, bloody head of the horse, kissing its eyes and mouth. He even tries to attack the giant peasant with his tiny fists before his father carries him away. Now, from a psychological profiling standpoint, what is happening here?
Well, the dream is a manifestation of extreme cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
Raskolnikov's conscious intellectual mind has decided to commit a brutal murder. But his subconscious, his fundamental human empathy, is screaming in rebellion. And in the dream, he is actually playing every part of his own internal war.
This is exactly what I was thinking. He identifies with the helpless victim, the old horse, which represents the old pawnbroker he plans to kill.
Right.
He also identifies with the brutal, remorseless killer, the peasant swinging the crowbar. And crucially, he is the innocent child weeping over the violence, representing his own suppressed conscience.
The dream is his brain showing him his own fundamental revulsion to violence. He wakes up in a cold sweat, shaking, and literally prays to God to show him how to escape these evil thoughts.
He is physically repulsed by his own plan. He almost gives it up entirely.
But then, Dostoevsky introduces the element of coincidence, or, as Raskolnikov prefers to frame it, fate.
Oh, yeah. He's walking through the Haymarket, and he happens to overhear a conversation revealing that the pawnbroker's sister, Lizaveta, will be out of the apartment the next evening at exactly 7 o'clock. The pawnbroker will be completely alone.
He hears this, and instead of seeing it as a random coincidence, his diseased mind views it as the universe pushing him forward.
He removes his agency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He thinks, fate made me do it. The path is cleared. It's such a common psychological defense mechanism to strip yourself of responsibility.
So he executes the plan. And the contrast between the clinical mathematical theory and the messy visceral reality is stark. Let's look at the mechanism of the crime itself.
Okay.
He goes to her apartment.
Yeah.
He has carefully sewn a loop inside his overcoat to hide the axe he stole from the porter's lodge. He has a complicated knot tied around a fake silver cigarette case to distract her.
Very calculated.
When she turns her head to untie the knot, he takes out the axe. And note this detail, he strikes her on the top of the head with the blunt end of the axe. 3 times. She dies instantly.
And you have to ask, why the blunt end? Why does that matter?
Right, why?
Because using the blunt end is a calculated, almost mechanical action. It is the execution of a theory. It represents his prefrontal cortex, his reasoning brain, trying to maintain control over the violence.
But the perfect crime unravels literally seconds later.
Yes, he is shaking, panicked, fumbling with her keys, trying to open her money box, making mistakes.
And then the ultimate chaotic variable enters the equation. He hears a noise. He walks out of the bedroom, and there is the pawnbroker's sister, Lizaveta.
Oh.
The meek, gentle, innocent woman who is supposed to be gone. She has walked into the apartment and is standing there, paralyzed with horror, looking at her dead sister.
And this is the exact moment the extraordinary man theory dies completely. Raskolnikov doesn't stop and carefully calculate the utilitarian utility of killing Lizaveta.
He doesn't weigh her life against the betterment of mankind.
No. He acts out of pure, base animal terror. The fight-or-flight response totally overrides his philosophical programming.
He charges at her and strikes her with the axe, too. But this time, it's with the sharp blade, splitting her skull open.
The shift from the blunt end to the sharp blade is the physical manifestation of his shift from calculated principle to sheer animal panic.
He has just brutally murdered an innocent, gentle woman who never harmed anyone. The math is broken.
The immediate aftermath is a portrait of physiological system failure. His nervous system completely crashes.
Yeah, he forgets to lock the front door. He gets covered in the victim's blood. 2 men come to visit the pawnbroker, find the door locked from the inside, and realize someone is in there.
He's trapped.
Raskolnikov is locked inside with the bloody bodies, standing inches away from the door, listening to the men rattle the handle. He barely escapes by hiding in an empty apartment downstairs when the men go to find the porter.
And then he slips out, returns the axe, goes back to his room, and just collapses.
So, what does this all mean? We have to look at the massive irony here. In Raskolnikov's own published article, he theorized that ordinary criminals always get caught because they get physically sick and lose their reason when they commit a crime.
Right, their bodies betray them.
But he assumed he wouldn't get sick. He thought he was immune because his act wasn't a common crime, it was a justified principle. He thought his intellect could overpower his biology.
But his body completely overrides his intellect. Dostoevsky's insight into the autonomic nervous system is astonishing here. For days after the murder, Raskolnikov is plunged into a delirious, brain-boiling fever.
He is obsessively cutting microscopic bloody fringes off his clothes. He is hiding stolen trinkets under a rock in a courtyard without even looking at how much money he actually stole.
When he is summoned to the police station for a simple, unrelated debt, he overhears an officer mention the murder, and he literally faints dead away on the floor.
His physical revulsion destroys his intellectual arrogance. His body is acting like it has ingested a lethal poison, and the poison is guilt.
And the isolation is absolute.
Yeah, he shouts at one point, trying to justify himself to his own mind. I didn't kill a human being, but a principal. I killed the principal, but I didn't overstep. I stopped on this side.
But he's lying to himself.
The crime doesn't elevate him to the status of a Napoleon. It exiles him from the human race. He sits in a room with his mother and sister, who love him desperately, and he feels like he is separated from them by a million miles. He realizes he can never speak to them honestly again.
He is trapped in a prison of his own making before the police even suspect him. But his erratic, self-destructive behavior fainting at the police station, returning to the scene of the crime to ring the doorbell and ask the bewildered painters about the blooding, it draws attention.
He is practically begging to be caught.
He is. And this brings him into the crosshairs of a man who doesn't use magnifying glasses, fingerprints, or physical evidence to solve crimes. He uses the human mind.
Enter Porfiry Petrovich, the lead investigator. Porfiry is the anti-Sherlock Holmes. Holmes looks for the tobacco ash, the footprint in the mud, the physical deduction. Porfiry has absolutely zero physical evidence linking Raskolnikov to the crime. No DNA, no cameras, no murder weapon.
But from the very first moment he meets him, Porfiry knows with absolute terrifying certainty that Raskolnikov is guilty.
How does he know?
Because Porfiry reads psychology the way Holmes reads footprints. He sees a brilliant, impoverished former law student who wrote an article justifying murder, who happens to be connected to the victim, who faints when the murder is mentioned, and who acts with aggressive, unnatural defensiveness.
The psychological math is obvious to Porfiry, but he can't arrest him without proof.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want you to imagine Porfiry as a modern-day hostage negotiator. Or, if you've ever watched the old TV show Columbo, Porfiry is exactly like that.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison.
He acts a little bumbling, a little disorganized, overly friendly, always wearing a dressing gown, offering tea, but every single word out of his mouth is a meticulously laid psychological trap.
Every single word.
He gives Raskolnikov so much conversational rope that the killer actively starts trying to build his own gallows. I mean, just imagine the sheer terror of sitting across a desk from someone who knows your darkest, most horrific secret, but they refuse to just arrest you. They just smile and talk to you about philosophy.
Porfiry's methods are a masterclass in psychological warfare. Let's look at their first major interview.
Okay, set the scene.
Raskolnikov goes to Porfiry's apartment, supposedly to ask about retrieving the items he pawned with the old woman.
Right.
Porfiry casually, almost innocently, brings up Raskolnikov's published article about the extraordinary men. He strokes Raskolnikov's ego. He engages him in a deep, rigorous intellectual debate about whether great men have the right to kill.
He lets Raskolnikov expound on his theories, puffing himself up.
And then Porfiry springs the trap. The mood suddenly shifts, and Porfiry asks with a mocking little smile, "Doesn't that theory tempt you to crime? Are you an extraordinary man? Did you step over the line?" And Raskolnikov tries to play it cool. He says, "If I had done so, I would not tell you." But his nervous system is screaming. He is sweating. His heart is racing.
And Porfiry doesn't stop there. He lets Raskolnikov know that he is fully aware of his erratic behavior. He mentions that he knows Raskolnikov went back to the crime scene and rang the bell.
He even traps him with a trick question about seeing painters at the apartment, which Raskolnikov barely manages to navigate.
Porfiry's playing a game of cat and mouse, but the mouse thinks he's a lion. Porfiry explicitly explains his own strategy to Raskolnikov later.
What does he say?
He says that if he arrests a suspect too soon without hard evidence, the criminal retreats into a legal shell. They get a lawyer, they deny everything, they fight back legally.
Right.
But if he leaves the suspect free, knowing that the police suspect him but not knowing what evidence they have, the criminal will be tortured by suspense.
The psychological pressure will build until the criminal inevitably makes a fatal mistake, or simply confesses out of sheer nervous exhaustion. Porfiry uses a brilliant metaphor here.
The moth and the candle?
Yes. He tells Raskolnikov, "Have you ever seen a moth near a candle? Well, he'll keep circling around me, like a moth around a candle. Freedom will no longer be dear to him."
It's agonizing to watch. Raskolnikov is practically screaming at him during their second interview, slamming his fist on the desk. "If you have evidence, arrest me. Don't play with me. I won't allow you to torture me."
But Porfiry just smiles and acts confused, like, "Why are you so upset? We're just having a friendly chat."
And then right when Raskolnikov is about to break, something incredible happens that completely upends Porfiry's strategy.
The confession.
A painter named Nikolai bursts into the office, falls to his knees, and confesses to the murders.
It is a shocking, chaotic moment. Raskolnikov is saved by the bell, but Porfiry knows almost immediately that it's a false confession.
I found this part so fascinating because a modern listener might think, Why on earth would a random painter falsely confess to a brutal double-axe murder? But Porphyry figures it out because he understands the cultural psychology of the time.
Exactly. Porphyry realizes that Nikolai's confession lacks psychological authenticity. He cross-examines him and sees that Nikolai doesn't know the actual details of the crime scene.
But why confess?
Porphyry realizes that Nikolai is part of a specific, very intense sect of Russian Orthodoxy. In this sect, there is a deep-seated, almost fanatical belief in the spiritual value of taking on suffering, even for crimes you didn't commit.
Wow.
Nikolai feels he is a sinner in a general existential sense, and he wants to suffer unjustly to achieve spiritual purification.
Let's give a modern equivalent to make this clearer. Think about extreme cases of modern guilt or the self-flagellation you sometimes see in internet cancel culture.
Okay.
Sometimes people will publicly take the blame for systemic issues or confess to immense moral failings that they didn't directly cause, purely out of a desire to be seen as taking on the burden of collective guilt.
Right.
They want the punishment because the punishment feels purifying. Nikolai is doing the 19th century religious version of that. He wants to be a martyr.
That is a very apt analogy. So Porphyry lets Nikolai confess to keep up appearances, but he doesn't stop pursuing Raskolnikov. And this is the most crucial aspect of Porphyry's character.
He doesn't just want a conviction.
No. He doesn't just want to throw Raskolnikov in a dark cell and throw away the key to improve his closure rate. He actually wants to rehabilitate him.
This blew my mind. The detective wants to save the murderer.
Because Porphyry represents the ideal of Russian justice in Dostoevsky's eyes. In their final meeting, Porphyry drops the act. He speaks to Raskolnikov directly, man to man. He says, "I know you did it." And he urges him to turn himself in.
Why?
Because he believes that forced legal punishment, just dragging a man away in chains, is spiritually useless. It breeds resentment. The criminal must voluntarily accept their own guilt and willingly embrace the suffering of prison to be spiritually cleansed.
Porphyry tells him, "You have a great heart. Suffering is a great thing. Do not be afraid of it." Porphyry is trying to save Raskolnikov's soul.
But Raskolnikov isn't ready for that. He is still fighting this brutal war inside his own head. He refuses to confess.
And as he crumbles under Porphyry's relentless pressure, he leaves the police station and encounters 3 characters in the city who act as living mirrors. They reflect the different paths his soul could take.
Yes, Dostoevsky brilliantly uses these 3 characters as foils to map out the entire spectrum of morality in 19th century Russia.
Let's look at the first mirror, the absolute extreme of nihilism, the decadent Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov.
Svidrigailov, he is basically Raskolnikov's dark twin.
He is Dunya's former employer, a wealthy landowner who tried to seduce her and completely ruined her reputation before his wife intervened. Svidrigailov comes to St. Petersburg, and he immediately recognizes a kindred spirit in Raskolnikov. He even tells him, "We are birds of a feather."
Svidrigailov represents the terrifying, logical endpoint of Raskolnikov's nihilism. If you truly believe there is no objective morality, no God, and no consequence beyond the material world, then literally anything is permissible.
Svidrigailov has taken Raskolnikov's theory and lived it to the absolute fullest. He has committed horrendous crimes. It is heavily implied he murdered his wife, Marfa Petrovna, possibly with poison.
He is a known pedophile. He drove a young, deaf servant boy to suicide through his cruelty.
And yet, unlike Raskolnikov, Svidrigailov feels no acute physical guilt. He doesn't get feverish. He doesn't faint at police stations.
Right. He seems to have successfully bypassed his conscience entirely. He got away with it.
But his punishment is different, and in a way, it's worse. His punishment is a crushing, infinite, existential boredom.
Total emptiness.
He is entirely hollow inside. He tells Raskolnikov that without women and debauchery, he would be so bored he'd have to shoot himself. He's haunted by ghosts, literal ghosts of his wife and the servant he killed, but he isn't scared of them. He's just mildly annoyed.
And his view of eternity is so bleak.
He thinks eternity isn't some grand, fiery hell. He thinks eternity is just a small, dirty, soot-blackened bathhouse filled with spiders.
That image of the bathhouse with spiders perfectly encapsulates the terrifying banality of a life without moral meaning. Svidrigailov seeks one last attempt at redemption, or at least a distraction from his yawning emptiness, through Dunya's love.
Right.
He overhears Raskolnikov confessing his crime to Sonia, and he uses this knowledge to blackmail Dunya.
This leads to one of the most tense scenes I have ever read. He lures Dunya to his locked apartment. He tells her he will pay for her brother to escape to America. He will save Raskolnikov's life, but the price is her total physical submission to him.
He locks the door, he puts the key in his pocket, he He tells her no one can hear her scream.
But Dunya is not a victim. She pulls out a revolver, the very gun she took from Svidrigailov's late wife. She aims it right at his head, she fires, and the bullet grazes his hair.
She cocks it again and fires, but it misfires.
Svidrigailov stands there, completely unflinching. He realizes in that moment that she would rather kill him or die herself than ever love him.
And that realization that he cannot buy or force genuine human connection completely breaks whatever was left of him.
He gives up. He tells her to take the key and leave. And once she is gone, the profound emptiness of his nihilistic life finally caves in on him. He realizes he is a ghost already.
He spends his last night wandering in the damp, freezing rain and ends up in a seedy, wretched hotel room. He is plagued by horrifying dreams.
The dreams again?
He dreams of mice crawling under his clothes. He dreams of the beautiful young girl he drove to suicide, lying in a coffin surrounded by flowers.
And most chillingly, he dreams of finding a crying, freezing 5-year-old child, putting her to bed, only to see her innocent face contort into the leering, seductive face of a French harlot.
He sees the ultimate reflection of his own pure decadence. He realizes that he pollutes everything he touches. There is no salvation for him. He is entirely hollow.
So the next morning, he walks out into the damp street, walks up to a bewildered watchman, tells the man he is going to America, and shoots himself in the head. Is the ultimate fatal dead end for the theory that you can live without a moral compass.
Now, if Svidrigailov represents the extreme, violent end of nihilism, the second mirror represents something far more insidious because it's completely legal.
It represents Western economic selfishness. The capitalist bureaucrat Peter Petrovich Luzhin.
Luzhin is Dunya's arrogant fiancé. And to bring our sources back to Charles Dickens for a moment, Dostoevsky creates a villain here who is deeply Dickensian in his repulsiveness, but with a very specific philosophical purpose.
Yes. When I was reading about Luzhin, I instantly thought of Uriah Heep from David Copperfield, that kind of slimy, falsely humble, intensely calculating social climber who uses the legal system to crush people while claiming to be entirely righteous.
Exactly.
But what's so interesting is that I want to push back on the idea of Luzhin as a criminal, because legally, Luzhin is completely innocent. He hasn't murdered anyone, but morally, he is arguably the most repulsive character in the entire book.
What's fascinating here is how Dostoevsky forces us to define evil. Luzhin is the physical embodiment of utilitarian economics, what we might call early, unbridled capitalism.
He explicitly states that by serving himself, by hoarding wealth and getting rich, he is ultimately helping society because a rising tide lifts all boats.
He twists Adam Smith's economic theories to justify his own rampant selfishness.
And his selfishness is predatory. He specifically wants to marry Dunya because she's poor and has been publicly humiliated by Svidrigailov's rumors. He doesn't want an equal partner.
No, he wants a wife who has been saved from starvation by him, so she will look upon him as her Lord and Savior. He wants someone who will be endlessly subservient and grateful to him forever.
And when Raskolnikov sees through this and ruthlessly exposes Luzhin, forcing Dunya to break off the engagement, Luzhin decides to take revenge.
But he doesn't attack Raskolnikov directly.
Like a true coward, he attacks the most vulnerable person he can find, Sonia Marmeladova.
This sequence is despicable. It really shows how legal actions can be infinitely crueler than a chaotic crime of passion.
Luzhin invites Sonia to his room, ostensibly to offer her a small donation of 10 rubles for her father's funeral. But secretly, while she isn't looking, he slips a 100-ruble note into her pocket.
Just incredibly malicious.
Later, at the funeral dinner, in front of all the guests, he bursts in and loudly accuses her of stealing the money. He demands she be searched. And of course, the 100-ruble note falls out of her pocket.
Think about the psychological violence of this act. He is trying to frame an innocent, destitute young woman who is already marginalized as a prostitute for a felony that would send her to a Siberian prison camp.
And he's doing it purely to discredit Raskolnikov, to prove to Dunya that her brother associates with thieves and prostitutes, hoping Dunya will come crawling back to him.
He is willing to completely destroy a young girl's life just to win a petty social argument.
Luckily, his roommate Lebezyatnikov sees him plant the money and exposes him. But it asks the listener to really stop and consider. Luzhin operates entirely within the law of economics and polite society, yet he is morally bankrupt. Raskolnikov is legally a murderer, but he is capable of deep empathy and compassion, who is truly the more evil man.
Dostoevsky clearly views Luzhin's cold, calculated legal selfishness as a profound spiritual crime, perhaps even worse than a crime of passion, because it lacks any internal struggle.
But the final mirror, the one that ultimately saves Raskolnikov from both the fate of Svidrigailov and the corruption of Luzhin, is the saintly sinner, Sonia Marmeladova.
Sonia, the daughter of the drunkard. We mentioned earlier that she was forced to take the yellow ticket and become a prostitute.
She did this to keep her younger step-siblings from literally starving to death. Her stepmother is dying of tuberculosis, coughing up blood, losing her mind, and Sonia bears the weight of the entire family on her fragile shoulders.
Yet, despite her defiled body, her soul remains remarkably pure. She is the embodiment of the traditional Russian Orthodox ideal.
She believes deeply in God, in the power of forgiveness, and crucially, in the redemptive power of shared suffering.
She hasn't become bitter or cynical like Raskolnikov.
No. When Raskolnikov visits her and brutally tells her that her sacrifices are useless, that her stepmother will die anyway and her siblings will end up on the street, he asks her why she doesn't just throw herself into the canal and end it. She is horrified by his lack of faith.
Raskolnikov is drawn to her precisely because she represents the complete opposite of his intellectual arrogance.
He goes to her squalid little room and he does something incredible. This proud, egotistical intellectual falls to the floor, bows down, and kisses the feet of a teenage prostitute.
He tells her, "I am not bowing to you. I am bowing to all human suffering."
It is a profound moment of recognition. He asks her to read from the Bible she keeps on her table. Specifically, he demands she read the story of Lazarus from the Gospel of John.
This is the story of Jesus raising a man who had been dead in a tomb for 4 days, his body already decaying. The imagery of resurrection, of being brought back from the spiritual dead through divine intervention, is the central, driving metaphor for Raskolnikov's entire journey.
And having seen the literal dead end of Svidrigailov's path suicide, and having rejected Luzhin's path of selfishness, Raskolnikov realizes he cannot carry his terrible secret alone. The isolation is crushing him.
He must choose between his intellectual pride and the messy, painful salvation of human connection. So he returns to Sonia's room to finally confess.
It is an agonizing, frustrating scene. He tries to explain his theories to her. He says he killed a louse. He says he wanted to be a Napoleon. He says he killed for money to help his mother.
He keeps changing his reasoning because when spoken aloud to a person of pure moral clarity, none of his intellectual justifications hold up to the light. They all sound pathetic.
She is completely appalled, not just by the physical act of the murder, but by his spiritual desolation. She tells him he has done the work of the devil.
But, and this is why she's this saintly figure, she doesn't abandon him. She doesn't run to the police.
She throws her arms around him and cries, "What have you done to yourself? There is no one in the world more unhappy than you." She shares his pain.
And she gives him the prescription for his salvation. She demands that he go to the crossroads in the Haymarket Square, kiss the earth that he has defiled, bow down to humanity, and confess publicly to the world.
She offers him a cypress wood cross to wear, telling him that they will bear the cross together, they will suffer together, and go to prison together.
Raskolnikov eventually complies, but with a massive critical caveat.
He goes to the square, he kisses the dirt, he goes into the police station and gives a full written confession. He is arrested. But, and this raises an important question about the nature of true repentance, he is still not truly repentant.
This drove me crazy reading the sources. You think he's finally had his breakthrough, but he hasn't.
Exactly. Even as he sits in the police station confessing, he does not believe that killing the pawnbroker was a moral crime.
He still thinks his theory was right.
He is confessing because he feels intense shame that he was too weak to bear the psychological burden of his actions. He is angry at his own biology.
He is furious at himself for not being the iron-willed Superman he thought he was. He confesses out of shattered pride, not a shattered conscience.
Dostoevsky refuses to give the reader cheap grace. Raskolnikov is tried and sentenced to 8 years in a Siberian labor camp.
His mother, Pulcheria, goes mad with grief and dies. Dunya marries his good, loyal friend Razumikin. And Sonia, incredibly true to her word, follows Raskolnikov all the way to Siberia to live in a village near the camp so she could visit him.
And even in Siberia, for the first year and a half, he is miserable. The physical labor doesn't bother him, but his mind is still sick. He is sullen, arrogant, and entirely alienated from the other prisoners.
The other convicts, who are uneducated peasants and actual hardened criminals, genuinely hate him. They hate him for his atheism, his intellectual arrogance, and his pride. They even try to kill him at one point.
He is also harsh and cold to Sonia when she comes to the gates to bring him food. He is still trapped in his own schism. He still believes his only mistake was failing the test of greatness.
But then comes the final breakthrough, the true resurrection.
It happens during the week after Easter again, leaning heavily into the symbolism of Lazarus and resurrection. Raskolnikov falls ill and is placed in the prison hospital, and he has one final, terrifying fever dream.
And as I read the description of this dream in the sources, I got chills because it is honestly terrifying how modern it sounds.
It is deeply prophetic. He dreams of a terrible worldwide plague spreading from the depths of Asia into Europe, but it's not a biological virus.
It's a plague of microscopic entities endowed with intelligence and will.
These microbes infect human beings, but instead of making them physically sick, they infect them with absolute unyielding ideological certainty.
Listen to this description. Everyone who is infected immediately believes that their own personal ideas, their own scientific conclusions, their own moral judgments are the absolute, unquestionable truth. They think they are infallible.
Imagine a world where every single person thinks they are the sole owner of the truth. Sound familiar?
In the dream, entire villages, cities, and nations go mad. They can't agree on what is evil or what is good. They don't know who to blame or who to acquit.
Men kill each other in a sort of senseless rage. Armies march against each other, but the soldiers turn and start butchering their own ranks before they even reach the battlefield because no one can agree on a common cause.
The alarm bells ring all day and night. Agriculture stops. Society completely collapses into global anarchy, famine, and destruction, all because of extreme, uncompromising ideological polarization.
Only a handful of pure souls are meant to survive to start a new race, but no one can find them.
I mean, you read that and you just think of the internet.
You think of social media echo chambers where everyone is so entirely convinced of their own righteousness that they are willing to verbally, socially, or even physically destroy anyone who disagrees. It's a plague of extreme ideological polarization.
The significance of this dream within the novel cannot be overstated. The disease in the dream is Raskolnikov's own intellectual arrogance writ large.
It is the logical, ultimate conclusion of his extraordinary man theory multiplied by millions.
He sees that if everyone decides they have the right to invent their own morality, if everyone decides they can step over the law for their own great ideas, the result isn't a beautiful utopia led by supermen. The result is the complete and utter annihilation of the human race.
The intellectual isolation he thought made him a god is actually a pathogen that destroys everything it touches. And it's this dream, this horrific vision of intellectual vanity destroying the world, not the 8-year prison sentence, that finally breaks Raskolnikov's ego.
He wakes up from the fever. A few days later, he goes out to work by the riverbank. Sonia approaches him timidly, holding out her hand to him, and something inside him finally, miraculously shatters.
He doesn't even know how it happens. The text says it was as if something snatched him and flung him to her feet.
He throws himself at her knees, weeping. He finally completely lets go of his Superman theory.
He realizes that all his intellect brought him was death and isolation, and that only through her infinite, unconditional love can he rejoin the human race.
He accepts her love, and in doing so, he accepts his connection to humanity and, in Dostoevsky's view, to God. Dostoevsky writes that they were both pale and thin, but those sick, pale faces were bright with the dawn of a new future, of a full resurrection into a new life. They were renewed by love.
It is human love, not the cold logic of the law, that ultimately resurrects his dead soul.
It's an incredibly powerful, earned ending.
To think we've gone from the real-life trauma of Charles Dickens in a bootblacking factory and Dostoevsky facing a firing squad straight to the bloody floor of a pawnbroker's apartment through this intense masterclass in psychological interrogation with Porphyry, all the way to the frozen expanse of a Siberian prison.
We've seen that the crime wasn't just the physical act of swinging the axe. The true crime was alienation.
The crime was Raskolnikov trying to sever his inherent connection to humanity. And the true punishment wasn't the police station or the Siberian labor camp. The true punishment was the agonizing, feverish isolation of his own mind.
Precisely. Dostoevsky leaves us with a profound, inescapable understanding that we cannot invent our own moral universe without destroying ourselves in the process.
We are fundamentally bound to each other, and breaking that bond carries a psychological toll that no amount of intellect, philosophy, or rationalization can outsmart.
Which leaves us with a lingering thought for you to take away from this deep dive.
In our modern era, we consume endless amounts of true crime podcasts, docuseries, and documentaries. We sit on our couches and analyze forensics. We debate motives on Reddit. And we often treat real-life killers as these fascinating intellectual puzzles to be solved from a safe distance.
But building on Dostoevsky's vision, we have to ask ourselves a really uncomfortable question.
By turning crime into a clinical, intellectual game for our own amusement, are we accidentally adopting the exact same detached, arrogant Superman mindset that doomed Raskolnikov in the first place?
Next time you dive into a true crime story, ask yourself, are you truly looking for justice? Are you trying to understand the deep tragedy of human nature? Or are you just looking for entertainment?
Are you honoring the messy, muddy, tragic reality of human suffering? Or are you just admiring the jagged white line on an X-ray, safely detached from the pain? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.